Well, hello everyone, welcome. I am Jessica Gonzalez and I am the School Mental Health Coordinator with the Mental Health Technology Transfer Center Network Coordinating Office. And I'm excited to facilitate today's session. Thank you for joining us for Supporting School Mental Health in the Context of Racial Violence, Session 2, Learning from and with the School Mental Health Workforce. For those of you who joined us last week, welcome back. And to those who are joining us now, welcome today. If this week is anything as powerful as last week, we are in for even more rich listening and learning today. Next slide. I just want to go through a couple of housekeeping items before we begin. As we're all adjusting to working from home, I'm sure that many of you have become very comfortable with Zoom video meetings. But in any case, I want to share a few reminders regarding the technical logistics of today's meeting. To ensure the best audio quality for the duration of the meeting, we have muted mics for all attendees, except for the speakers. If you have audio or technical issues during the session, the chat box is open for you to communicate with our team so that they may assist you. To open the chat box, just hover your cursor over the Zoom toolbar at the bottom of your window and click the chat icon. If you have questions for the presenters, please enter those in the question and answer pod. We have team members who are monitoring this Q&A pod, and they will ensure that the facilitators receive your questions. To open the Q&A pod, please hover your cursor over the Zoom toolbar at the bottom of your window and click on that Q&A icon. We have scheduled ample time for Q&A with our guests toward the end of the meeting, but please feel free to enter your question at any time during the presentation. If you have resources that you'd like to share with us, please put them in the Q&A pod and we'll include them in the Opportunities for Continued Learning resource that we hope to send out to all of you next week. We have made every attempt to make today's presentation secure. If we need to end the presentation unexpectedly, we will follow up using your registration information. You'll receive an email following the presentation next week on how to access a certificate of attendance, the session recording, and the slide deck will be posted on our website, but we will send it to you all as well. And if you don't already, please follow us on social media and stay in touch with us. Next slide, please. So again, welcome. Last week, we heard from advocates, school site and board leaders, community-based organization leaders, and student advocates. You can access the recording for session 1 on our website, and we'll also add the link in the chat box. If you are new to us, this is a 2-part series, and it is a collaborative effort of the Mental Health Technology Transfer Center Network, also known as MHTTC. We are a network funded by the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, and we include 10 regional centers, a national American Indian and Alaska Native Center, and a national Hispanic and Latino Center, as well as a network coordinating office. Our collaborative network supports resource development and dissemination, training and technical assistance, and workforce development for the mental health field. Next slide. Our network also has a specific initiative that focuses on school mental health. Our school mental health specific activities that are put on by the MHTTCs through our initiative encompass multiple service modes, various topic areas, and populations. Next slide. So this learning forum today is just one example of the training that we offer the school mental health workforce, all free of cost. We invite you to visit our website to learn more, and we'll add the link for our website in the chat box for everyone. Next slide. After today's session, you'll receive a roster of all of the MHTTCs in case you're interested in connecting with your regional center. Next slide. So lastly, just a really quick disclaimer. While we are funded by SAMHSA, the opinions that are expressed in this learning session are the views of our moderator and panelists, and they do not reflect the official position of the Department of Health and Human Services, or SAMHSA. Next slide. As part of receiving SAMHSA funding, we are required to submit data related to the quality of this event. At the end of today's training, we ask that you please take a moment to complete a brief survey about the session. All attendees are going to be automatically redirected to the survey when closing the webinar window when the event ends today. Next slide. Okay, that was a lot of information, I know, but now we'll officially get started. We're so pleased to invite Ebony Adedayo to moderate both sessions. As we experienced last week, Ebony is a skilled facilitator, educator, community organizer, scholar, and much more. Her bio is included in the speaker lineup. We're including that link in the chat box. So for time and flow, I will hand it over to Ebony. Ebony, thank you so much for being with us again today.
And Jessica, thank you so much for having me. Welcome all, and thank you for being here today. My name is Ebony Adedayo, and I am a graduate student at the University of Minnesota, earning a PhD in curriculum and instruction with minors in African American studies and culture and teaching. I'm focusing on culturally affirmative curriculum in the K-12 classroom, as well as institutions of higher learning, placing particular emphasis on the wellness of Black women teachers, students, and faculty in higher ed. So this conversation that we're going to have today is really important to me. Before we get started with the panelists, let's just do a little bit of background information on this conversation. Why this? Why now? A couple of words to help frame our conversation. Supporting school mental health in the context of racial violence is a two-part learning series intended for students, families, educators, and school mental health professionals who are navigating the impact of racial violence on student mental health. Our intention is to offer a conversation that focuses on strategies for supporting students' mental health while navigating racial violence, both in and out of school, opportunities for the field to improve its commitment to fostering a workforce ready, able, and willing to hold racial violence as a mental health issue, and steps we might take to advance school mental health supports for students experiencing racial violence. Today's session focuses on learning from and with the school mental health workforce, including school counselors, psychologists, and teacher educators. This is not an all-encompassing how-to. School mental health is complicated work. Navigating the impact of racial violence is complicated work. For some of us, this is an entirely new conversation, and others are very familiar with the conversation and is part of our everyday life and vernacular. We do not expect or intend that two 90-minute conversations will address everything, nor should they. With that in mind, we offer a couple working agreements for us as we listen in. To all of us, we will be in listen and reflect mode. You are invited to submit questions for the Q&A portion or send resources you would like our network to promote. Agree, argue, and aspire. With what do you agree? With what do you argue? To what do you aspire? Expect and accept a lack of closure. We won't get to everything today, and that's okay. This work is ongoing. To presenter guests, we agree and commit to making space, stepping in and stepping back when there is a question posed to all of us. And we commit to keeping our thoughts brief, spoken from our role and our experience, and respecting the frame in the nonpartisan audience of our MHTTC network. And raise your finger when you want to speak, or give another signal when you want to speak. So without further ado, let's begin and let's meet our guests. Dr. Mcquee Bailey, Dr. Lisa Wines, Angela Jones, Dr. Goldie Mohammed, and Dr. Janine Jones. For their complete bios, please refer to the link in the chat box. We also encourage all guests to put resources, thoughts, and responses to questions that come up in the chat box as you feel comfortable so that we can make this 90 minutes dynamic. So let's get started with our first question. And this question I'm gonna pose to everyone. And if you don't want to answer it, you don't have to, but if you have answers, please lead in and speak up. As we start, I wanna take the moment to recognize that this is the first week of August 2020. We've been through a lot this year. I've heard someone say that March went on for like 50 years, and I think that's accurate. So we've been through a lot, and many of us are amidst restructuring and rewiring our approach to teaching and learning. So as we kick off, I'm hoping we can introduce yourself, saying your name, your role, your location, and your pronouns, and also share what is one thing you have been doing for self-care lately. Let's go, Mcquee, Dr. Wines, Angela, Goldie, and Dr. Jones.
Ebony, thank you for that. Thank you all for having me today. My name is Mcquee Bailey. I'm trained as a counseling psychologist. I currently work as faculty at the University of North Dakota in the counseling and counseling psychology program. And so I've been in this role for my second tour here at UND for for 4 years thus far. In terms of kind of what I've been doing, I'm working with one of my colleagues, and we are launching a podcast in the next couple of weeks. Two psychologists being able to just talk about issues from relationships to politics and all points in between. So that's something that I've been trying to, or something that I've been working on to get through this time and really try to use my voice and create a platform for that. So again, thank you for having me.
Before the next person goes, can I encourage all of the panelists to stay on video during the duration of our conversation? Thank you. To the next person.
Hi, my name is Dr. Lisa Wines. Thank you everyone for having me. A little background about myself. I'm an associate professor at Lamar University, which is in a cool little town called Beaumont, Texas. Although I don't reside there, I reside in Houston, Texas. I've been in counselor education, entered into the field in 2005, and began adjunct teaching for many universities in Texas around 2008. Currently, I serve as an adjunct lecturer to the University of Houston Central Campus, where I teach graduate level master's courses in counseling. So I'm excited for this opportunity. My work is primarily in the area of school counseling. I own and operate a business in Cypress, Texas, L&A Professional Services, where myself, along with an intern program, I train interns annually in becoming licensed and obtaining their master's degree. So very excited for that. I was a former school counselor for about 10 years and worked in a school district within Cypress area, Cypress Fairbanks ISD. And then I've worked in 2 other school districts within the Houston area, Aldine and Alief Independent School District as well. I've currently got some textbook publications in the field of school counseling with co-editor Dr. Judy Nelson, and we've published on school counselors as practitioners, which is a real practically based textbook on how to perform the role of a school counselor, which is really etched neatly in a multiculturally competent framework. And I have a new textbook that will be released in October, critical cases, responding to critical cases in school counseling. It's a crisis intervention case study book where we really take an opportunity to give you the most real scenarios that really take place in a school. The racial conversation comes up in a lot of those case studies, along with other cases. So I'm really happy to be here and look forward to sharing my knowledge and my experience with all attendees. Thank you.
Dr. Wines, before you go, can you tell us one thing you're doing for self-care?
One thing I am doing for self-care is I CrossFit, and I spend time in the gym 3 to 4 days a week. And so while I do that, along with other things like meditation, which I teach my clients in my practice, but largely I try to work out as frequently as I can. Thank you for that.
Thank you. And I just want to remind all the other panelists to remember to keep your remarks brief, and we want to hear your introduction, and we also want to hear what you're doing for self-care. And so for the next person. And so Angela's up.
Hi, my name is Angela Jones. I am a school counselor at Booker T. Washington High School, which is located in Tulsa, Oklahoma. It is also my alma mater, so I'm a proud alumni of the school. I am currently working on my doctorate in education administration, and I am just so excited to be talking about this topic. And I'm excited to share my experiences and learn from everyone here. One thing that I am doing for self-care is gardening. I've taken up gardening, and I'm enjoying planting seeds and watching the plants grow and getting my hands in the soil. It's nice to be outside. I also have a little dog that I love taking for walks almost every morning, and he's loving all this extra time that I have to spend with him. So those are some things that I'm doing for self-care, and I'm just grateful to be here. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. My name is Goldie Mohammed, and I'm an associate professor of language and literacy in the middle and secondary education department at Georgia State University. Within that role, I'm also a teacher educator. Georgia State University is in Atlanta, Georgia. My work focuses on culturally and historically responsive education and how to cultivate the genius within our youth. My pronouns are she, her, and hers. And one thing that I do for joy is laughing every day, dancing every day, playing games with my family and friends. I just joined a Black women fitness virtual group. It doesn't bring me joy, but it's good for me. Some things that are good for us, we don't enjoy all the time, but it's good in the long run. And I'm so grateful to be here. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. I'm Dr. Janine Jones, and I'm a professor of school psychology at the University of Washington. I just finished an 8-year term of being the director of the specialist level and doctoral level school psychology program. My work is focused on culturally responsive interventions in school psychology practice, and I'll talk a little bit about that. For self-care, the things, she, her, and hers are my pronouns. And for self-care, I've been trying a variety of different things. Logic puzzles, I love. So I like doing those, Pilates. And then the new thing that I'm going to add now that we have more sunshine in Seattle is I'm going to get out on my inflatable kayak.
All of those things sound really, really fun. So thank you for sharing some more intimate pieces of your life during self-quarantine. So this second question is for Tom Mcquee and Dr. Wines. Both of your bodies of scholarship focus on helping professionals understand isms in bridging clinical and community mental health research and practice. Why don't both of you tell us a little bit about how your scholarship can support our understandings of the needs of this moment?
I can go first. Well, I think that practice and research are so important to go together and to walk hand in hand as we navigate how we'll help bring and uplift our clients and our students that we work with even. And so my publications are really etched largely in school counseling. There's a huge connection with just humanism and humanistic philosophical kind of basis, Black existentialism, and looking really strongly at the Black body and how you might work with African Americans in the field of mental health. And so how those works may help inform what we're doing is that you'll find always a practice-based kind of reasonable application, things that you can do as mental health professionals to work with a diverse population. African Americans have a very unique experience for the most part. When you work with them, you'll learn that. And so I think if you read my own research and my presentations and publications, you would find that there's, a huge part of validation in the experience and being able to, with empathy, hear that experience. And if you're even so, if you dare to try to vicariously experience on the other end in some mental capacity what those experiences were like. And so I think that my body of works contribute in that way for those who, have the opportunity to engage with the literature, but humanism and looking at how we have so much in common and how we approach just learning about each other. There's a lot linked there. So I would say that those are the trends, just kind of how to work with African American populations, how to do that in the school setting is kind of my body of work largely.
Dr. Wines, thank you for your just sharing that information. I really appreciate it. Ebony, thank you for the question. For me in the work that I do, I think I've really been focusing on moving people away from thinking about ism behavior, particularly in terms of racism, from extreme individual acts, but really starting to think about it from a more collective, systemic behavior that's rooted in culture, institutions, and our major settings. I think that's really important. And so actually this summer, I wrote an article that's actually in a magazine. And it is just coming out this week, I think, Second Thought magazine, but it really tries to offer a lay understanding of kind of looking at what's happening in society, understanding racism, and then moving into anti-racism, but really having people think about the kind of ism behavior, and I'll focus on racism as it really being systemic, institutionalized, and everybody being impacted by it. I think moving people away from thinking about this individual extremist behavior makes it, I think that if we say somebody's a racist, sexist, then it becomes trait that somebody says, I'm going to be this thing, or that person's going to be this thing forever, which creates defensiveness. And so I think it's important to talk about it in terms of its behavior, it's an ism, and that we all engage in it. Unfortunately, I as a part of the majority group of being male, I engage in sexism. It's not something that I own as a badge of courage or something that is good. It's we're socialized into that. So how do we engage in the anti-work for that? So I think that's where I focus on. I think that's the really important piece, that we really understand specifically racism in this instance, but how do we understand these isms from a more systemic understanding, our implicit or our connection, or how we contribute to that thing, and then what do we do to work to dismantle that? And I think that really reduces the defensiveness and allows people to engage in the work. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you all. I appreciate your responses to the question. This next question, I want to invite everyone into the conversation as they feel so inclined. Let's talk about what we're seeing right now. We're seeing more comfort with people naming the intersection of mental health and racism. Help us understand this intersection, especially how it impacts how we approach school mental health. What does the intersection of mental health and racism look and feel like?
I'll start. I would say within the larger racial constructs of systemic racism, I think traditionally the Black community has shied away from seeking out mental health services and counseling services. I guess there's somewhat of a stigma in the Black community about getting therapy. And as we begin to see more people of color going into this field of work, I think we'll start to see more people of color seeking out mental health services and addressing the issues that they have with their own mental health. In terms of school counseling, students don't get to pick their counselor. They're assigned a counselor. And if you find that you are counseling a student who is of a different ethnicity than yourself, and you don't know how to talk to them about what's going on in the world today, just acknowledge that that you don't know, that you have questions, and then invite them to give you their perspective on what's going on and express to you how they are feeling. So it's about giving them an open space and allowing them that opportunity to process their emotions and talk to you about how they're feeling. And it's not really a time for you to be giving opinions or advice. It's really a time to just do more listening and do less lecturing.
Yeah, and if I can add to that with this question, first, as a teacher educator, I am grateful that some folks, right, are finally coming into the fold and coming into their consciousness. They're finally able to say the words Black Lives Matter. Some folks have been teaching our Black students and our brown students and could not physically say those words. I'm glad that folks are finally being comfortable with even talking about mental health and race and racism. Some folks really need mental help around and mental health therapy around anti-racism. How can you teach our youth if you are not well? You know, that has to be at the core of everything. If you are racist, you will either promote racism or ignore racism in our schools, and both can be very harmful and violent. So I work with teachers and pre-service teachers and helping them to do the internal work of racism by helping them to ask themselves, are you racist? Do you subscribe to colonized thinking? Where did you learn it? Who are the people around you? Are they perpetuating it? And then how will you recognize and interrupt it? Because if we consider society like a whole body and the systemic parts or our limbs are a part of it, and one limb is just the school, racism and mental health affects the limbs, right? If the parts of our limbs are not well, we are not well as a society. And right now, parts of schools and our teachers and our students are not fully well. So if we're going to think about this idea of racism and mental health and mental wellness, it affects everything that we do. And we have to look at the historicalness of it, the institutionalized work of it, the personal of it, like what's inside of me, before we get to the instruction. So many times educators just want strategies in the instruction, but no, let's take a step back of how we got here with this institutionalized and systemic racism that exists.
So I'd like to add a little bit too, because I absolutely agree with Dr. Goldie here. I'm one of the scholars that actually refers to racism as an ACE, as an adverse childhood experience that is really insidious, and it's part of the experience of all BIPOC youth, and it attacks their resilience. And excuse me. And unfortunately, as we are thinking about serving kids in schools, we're usually in this place of when there's a situation with some kind of racism, we see it as an isolated incident. And we treat that one incident, but we don't recognize that everyone and all the children are experiencing racial violence in different forms, that it's not just physical violence, but it's also things like implicit bias and dehumanization and those micro invalidations that happen throughout the day. And so if we acknowledge that for a stressor that is being experienced all of the time, we're much more likely to be able to reach the kids and teach the kids in the spaces where they should feel like they're safe and belong, and recognize it as part of our work that we're supposed to be doing. And when we normalize that is an experience of many youth, then we can choose mental health interventions that are going to support everybody and not just treating racist incidents or experiences as isolated and not related to everyone that's in the setting.
I want to add something, if you don't mind. Maybe in the year 2002 or somewhere close to that, there was a publication that came out by an author, Poussaint, and he talked about in there whether or not racism was considered a mental health disorder. And this has been a conversation in like psychiatry and psychology for quite some time, where it had then eventually been determined that it was not, because it was such a common thing. And where there is common practices and common links, then how can anything about it be abnormal, right? Okay, so with that basis in mind, you have to think about when you're working with students and or if you're treating clients that, you know, what is your belief system? Do you see racist actions and violence and the tendency of such to be problematic in terms of mental health and the conditions of the mind? Is it a condition of the mind? And so you can read the literature out there on that argument, but I think it fundamentally comes down to the perception of that student in front of you, and whether or not it was perceived as such. and your ability to be open enough to hear that language and that experience, those hurts and all of that expressed. And then what do you do in order to help bring someone through processing the experience, by listening to the experience, by establishing goals to work with that student through that experience. That's something as school counselors and practitioners, whatever the field, mental health related field it may be, that you have to be willing to journey with them on. That's kind of my fundamental thought. So yes, there is always that discussion of whether or not severe extreme racism is a symptom. Does it lead to post-traumatic stress? All these conversations are going on, and I think it's our responsibility to be a part of those conversations and to understand where our students and our clients fall in terms of their own personal experience.
Thank you, Dr. Wines. Dr. Jones, the next question is for you. Let's hear from you as a professor of school psychology. Talk to us about how culturally responsive school-based interventions can be used to address the experience of racial violence.
Yeah, thanks for the question. I have to start with one of my biases. I'll say that one of my biases is that I think that resilience is a core protective mechanism that we all have, that it pre-exists in everyone, and that we have to live our lives trying to maintain it, and that experiences like racial violence kind of chip away at the resilience. And so when we are intentional about choosing culturally responsive interventions, we are picking things that are grounded in bolstering a person's protective mechanisms. And by saying that, what I mean is that we are meeting the person where they are, knowing what protective factors in their cultural contexts are appropriate, and using those to shape our interventions to support them. So school mental health clinicians, like if they're recognizing that racism isn't just physical violence, but it takes the form of implicit bias and dehumanization and those microaggressions that occur daily, and even micro invalidations that happen between people, that those interactions are chipping away at a person's resilience. And so critical elements of an intervention that are done with youth, in particular in schools, will include things like helping promote a positive racial identity and giving them a sense of purpose, helping them know that they are not only physically safe, but emotionally safe. They need to have a sense of belonging as part of their racial community as well as the school community. And then they need to, as part of the work that you're doing, need to recognize that the concept of racial socialization is occurring. So they have people, family members that are supporting, helping them understand who they are as a racial being and how to cope with things that contradict their internalized beliefs about themselves. So any mental health interventions with these features, we have lots of research that it continues to come out that's showing that better outcomes are associated with BIPOC youth in particular, especially Black youth, when they incorporate these kinds of principles. So racial identity and the belonging and safety and racial socialization.
Thank you, Dr. Jones. This next question is for Dr. Jones and Dr. Wines, but others, if you feel like you have a response, please feel free to jump in as well. Since the murder of George Floyd and many others, we've seen pre-service associations, fields, and professions have an awakening to the disparities in our preparation approach. And so I have a two-part question. As professors whose work involves pre-service education and training for school counselors and school psychologists, how do you need to be training future school mental health professionals differently? And the second part of that question, how do you train aspiring professionals now so that when they enter schools, they feel supported and informed to understand their own identity and those of their students?
Dr. Wines, you want to go?
I can go first, sure.
Okay.
So to start, I think, how do we train differently? How would I train differently? Well, it's understood that some of the basics are necessary in mental health, and in school counseling, how the techniques that are utilized in the theory by which we understand those we serve. I think all of that's essential. And then we have our one multicultural course. And while we're grateful for that one multicultural course, very happy about that, we then have textbooks and other courses that have a chapter somewhere on multiculturalism. I think that we have to be more intentional when we even bring in graduate level students. What are your beliefs and thoughts, and tell us now? And that may sound a little too invasive early on, but it would be nice to even upon acceptance, right? A matriculation into the program, that you could then assess change and reassess development based on those fundamental pieces. So I think that understanding students where they are at the onset of acceptance is more critical than just teaching the skills and making sure you can say, hi, how are you in a session, and giving more weight to things like that. You're kind of understanding the practitioners that we're endorsing and credentialing, eventually credentialing. So I would offer up that there would maybe be more of a portfolio-based review process of graduate students that's really more neatly tied with multicultural development and competence in that area. And I'll pause there and we can get to part two after you.
Okay.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. So the for school psychologists, I share the same concern about, we have the one multicultural course, which I've been the one to teach for 15 years. And then we have other infusion. But I think the place that I have really done the most work with students has been for school psychologists to know that our field has historically pathologized the abilities and the behavior of Black and Brown youth for generations. And if we continue to sustain our old practices, we're complicit in oppressing these groups of people. So it's really important to directly discuss how our practices contribute to things like disproportionality of Black and Latinx and Indigenous youth in special education and in disproportionate discipline. So if we know that our practices have really created this divide that we have, and that we continue to do so, that we're replicating the same harm that's been existing forever. And so as part of the work, it's recognizing the history and how we're complicit by doing the same practices. And then we have to train them to be intentional, to make better choices of the tools that we use for assessment and the ways in which we do counseling interventions with youth, and helping us get to a way where everyone feels like they understand the people that they serve. That's kind of the overarching theme, and having very, very direct conversations, difficult conversations, but identifying, here are some specific ways that you need to look at yourself, just like you were saying, Dr. Wines, that having to recognize our own view shapes how we decide, or the decisions that we make about kids. And so helping them kind of get to the start of that is really important in the first year of training, which I guess brings us to the next question,
yeah,
right?
Right. And I'll add this part to it as well. How odd of us, right, to think that we're going to help people when we haven't helped ourselves yet.
Right.
How strange is it for us to want to believe that our students are going to be vulnerable, and that they're going to be open, and that they're going to be transparent, when we haven't really done our own work. We really don't understand why we have the tendencies or have the racist viewpoints that we have. We haven't really challenged our grandparents' ideologies and our parents' ideologies, nor have we reframed or restructured our own cultural belief system, our own worldview. So then we're stuck, right, in a pattern at which somebody gave to us. And here we are in our 30s and 40s, 50s, still believing something someone told us, and we're not intuitive enough to know. We're not educated enough to know that that should all be challenged. So I think that's the starting point. Mm-hmm. And then as we work with students to become more aware of themselves so that they can work with others, I think that's the starting place. When students come in, you do have to listen and accept that it's real for them. generating questions about the validity and whether or not it actually happened in these ways, I think, again, is kind of judgy, and it doesn't allow us to really be there present for our students. So being very much aware, doing your own work first before you get into the field, really approaching that internal dialogue and the beliefs that have been passed down, and then being willing to hear openly from our students and clients alike, I think is a great starting place. Your identity grows when you work with families, then you work with students, and your position on issues change when you speak to the violators and those who have been violated. And we don't get to really choose those sides, but oftentimes we find ourselves doing just that. So
yeah. So having taught the standalone course for so many years, I've kind of created this model that aligns with the work of Daryl Wing Sue and Stanley Sue that uses the tripartite model. And the first phase of the course is learning about self and doing reflection and looking at internalized biases. And then the second phase is focusing on building cultural literacy, where you're avoiding othering and learning about other cultures with very intentional projects and relationship building. And then at the end of the quarter, it's focusing on applying practice and interpreting our skills in the lens of the cultural literacy and our own self-internalized processes. And so part of what I've learned over time, in the beginning, I had a structure and kind of taught things a certain way, and I didn't bring myself into it as much. I kind of tried to keep myself separate. And over time, I found that that was not helpful. And I had to be vulnerable because I'm asking the students to be vulnerable. So I started doing things like using experiential learning and relationship building so they feel safer taking risks, not only with me, but with each other, and pushing outside of their comfort zone. And I actually say some direct things like, you cannot be a good school psychologist if you view the world from your own lens. You have to be able to be transformed in relationships with new people and new cultures and new identities. And by saying things like that, I'm almost like challenging them to do things differently. And so by the end of the term, it's just a way of getting things started. And it's a first year spring quarter course. And I actually was teaching this course at the same time.
Dr. Jones?
Yeah.
I don't want to cut you off, but
I'm sorry.
Nope, you're fine.
Yeah.
I just want to make sure that we have enough time for some of the other questions. Your remarks have been beautiful, but I want to make sure that we're moving along. So I'm sorry about that. But the next question is for Angela, actually. As a school counselor, what does supporting students navigating racial violence look like? What training, support, and preparation did you explicitly receive in your education to prepare you for leading this work? And what do you wish you had received?
Yes, well, much like what Dr. Wines was saying, I did take one course in multicultural counseling within my program, and we explicitly went over many different cultural groups and ethnicities, the characteristics of those groups, the traditions, and the traits. And so we did learn, or I learned a lot about microaggressions and macroaggressions from that course, like Dr. Jones was saying earlier. And it allowed me to reflect on some instances of my own where I had experienced those types of microaggressions. But I think the most important thing I learned from that course was really social justice. So that is where we move from talking about the problem and actually go make solutions and change the problems. So it's more so about less talking, more action. So yes, we're having the conversations, we're getting the dialogue out, but what are we doing? What are we doing to actually change what's going on in the world today? So that's a little background on my class. And then as a school counselor, I really ascribe to solution-focused therapy because it's quick, it's brief, and honestly, we just don't have the time to go through all of the long, extended, maybe CBT theories that you would work with some students on with mental issues, because we have, as school counselors, a laundry list of a lot of other responsibilities, academics, graduation checks. That's the big thing there is got to get kids graduated. So solution-focused therapy works best for me when I'm working with students with socio-emotional issues. And I think what we can do to move forward to help students in this racial climate is create spaces and opportunities for students to talk about racism. Our school district has decided to go virtual for the first 9 weeks. So I haven't seen my students since mid-March, and I'm not sure when I'll see them next, honestly. So it's gonna be difficult to kind of understand how that's gonna play out. Everything is gonna be virtual on Zoom. So you could maybe form student groups through Zoom or whatever social media platforms the students are already involved in. Support groups, both mixed races and support groups with just, people of marginalized groups, so that they can talk about what's going on in the world today, and they can have that outlet to express themselves and get their emotions out and feel heard. In high school, I think students are really starting to form their identity. They're starting to speak up, they're starting to speak out. We as staff and administrators and counselors are trying to teach students self-advocacy, and they are starting to advocate for themselves. We have students at my school who love to protest. And that's good, we encourage that, So it's really about letting them feel comfortable in that space, and getting what it is they need to get out, and having that free opportunity to express themselves.
Thank you, Angela. Do others feel the need to also respond to the question? Otherwise, we can move on to the next question. All right, we'll move on. Goldie, this same question that I want to pose to you is also one that Dr. Jones and Dr. Wines answered. As professors whose work involves pre- and in-service teacher education, how do we need to be training future teachers differently? How do you train your students now so that when they enter the teacher-student relationship, they feel supported and informed to understand their own identity and those of their own students?
Yeah, so this is a wonderful question, and I'm thankful for the sisters before me who answered it really well within their field. So I'm going to be very clear of what we need to do. First, we need to stop hiring racist professors who are not equipped or prepared to teach in anti-racist ways. And I'm not just talking about College of Educations, I'm talking about throughout the whole university. We need to change our hiring processes and our protocol and our interview questions to get socially political and conscious level professors. This should not be just on the professors of color or the conscious level professors that are currently in our departments. We need to question, rewrite, reframe the textbooks that we teach with, the theories we teach with. If only white folks have written your textbooks or the course, the textbooks you adopt in the course, that's a very problematic thing. For teacher educators, stop teaching Dewey, Vygotsky, Maslow, Piaget, as if these are the exemplars. They have no record of successfully teaching Black and brown kids, and that's who we're struggling to get it right with the most in our country, is Black and brown youth. Teach Mary McLeod Bethune, Anna Julia Cooper, W.B. Du Bois, Carter G. Woodson. Start teaching in a way that's grounded in Black excellence and cultural studies. We have focused on whiteness in our teacher ed programs for too long, or Eurocentricity. It's time to use Black historical excellence as a model for all students. And teaching, as Dr. Wines mentioned, it cannot be diversity, and anti-racism cannot be an add-on. It cannot be tokenized. It cannot be one course. Our syllabi must be anti-racism and grounded in criticality and anti-racism. So when I teach my courses, I ask myself 4 questions, which is the motto held in my book. How am I helping my future teachers cultivate their identity development as future teachers? 2, what skills am I teaching on how to become a strong and excellent teacher? 3, what new knowledge am I teaching them about history of education? And 4, how am I teaching them to be anti-racist teachers? That's the criticality. How am I teaching them about anti-racism? Again, it cannot just be held in one course. We also need an entire course of what Dr. Yolanda Seeley-Ruiz calls the Archaeology of Self. We need an entire course in teacher education that pushes students to unpack their racism, their sexism, their homophobia, their religious discrimination, anything that they have been conditioned to believe from childhood to adulthood. And in each course, we need to push the idea of mental health. Being a teacher is exhausting, is difficult. We don't value our teachers, nor do we pay them what they deserve. It is a surface field, and every teacher needs a therapist, is what I always say. And so how do we, in our teacher ed programs, teach teachers of how to take care of themselves more than just going to a salon or getting a massage? I'm talking about authentic self-care, and how to know themselves. Because if you do not know who you are, how are you going to teach a child who they are? If you do not love Blackness, how are you going to teach a child to love their Blackness? So I would just say that we need to model this kind of approaches and be the educators that we want them to be.
Thank you so much. Your words really spoke to me. I was over here just like, yes, 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 like right on. Thank you for that. This last question, I think, relates to some of the things that you were saying, Goldie. And I'm going to pose it to Tom Mcquee, Goldie, and Dr. Jones. And it's another two-part question. As we know, the school counselor, the psychologist, and teacher workforce is disproportionately white, just female in comparison to the student population across the country. So how do we grapple with this imbalance? How might we encourage, train, and recruit more school mental health professionals of color, specifically those who identify as Black? And then the second part to that question, how might we prepare those in the field to be better trained and resourced to support their students navigating racial violence, even if they are not themselves Black or BIPOC?
I'll go first. Okay. For the first part of your question, we've been grappling with this challenge of the imbalance in school psychology forever and continue to do so, but it's getting important to recognize that representation is important, and that if we have adults in the lives of youth that look like them, they're more likely to go into careers that match that. And so one of the things in my program, there was a notable shift in enrollment of school psychology and applicants, as well as those that have come into the program, when we revised our mission to explicitly focus on culture responsive practices and mental health, that more applicants could see themselves. Also, when they saw some of the research that we were doing that focused on racial identity and belonging. So if we do the work that focuses on the needs of historically marginalized groups and we're modeling that, it seems like that helps with drawing people to the profession, because we're demonstrating a shared value and kind of signaling to prospective students that they have a home with us.
Just to follow with what Dr. Jones was saying, I think it is really a multi-pronged, kind of truly systemic approach that we have to take. I think one of the first things we have to do is Dr. Goldie was saying, in terms of really thinking about what the institutional structure looks like from the provost, the president on down, in terms of really how to, what systems are in place that are contributing to students of color, to women, to other minoritized folks not going into higher education, not getting graduate education. So I think that we have to start there in terms of thinking about the imbalance. I think we have to really connect colleges to high schools and middle schools, and not just through summer programs and or going to those colleges for recruitment occasionally. But I think really, what does it mean in terms of what we're teaching? So Dr. Goldie was really, not that I need to affirm you, but you're really accurate in terms of what are we teaching. And so what the curriculum doesn't reflect me, as Dr. Jones was saying, if I don't see myself reflected by the people who are instructing, who are part of that institution, I don't feel valued. I don't feel validated in my experience, and thus I don't go to that institution, right? I'm struggling with my university now when I keep seeing, people who don't look like me or other students of color, other minoritized folks who are on our website. And so something that's very small, but it sends a very loud message. And so I think that's what's important. But I also think we have to have buy-in, right? So as Dr. Jones says, she's been teaching multicultural for 15 years. People of color can't be the only people who are engaged in this work. And the other thing is that, this past 5 months, everybody's been saying they're woke. You have to wake up before you woke. And so I really, what that means is what Dr. Goldie was saying, right? Like people need to center themselves, locate themselves in the readings. Go listen to Marvin Gaye, go read Angela Davis, go understand what is being said in the Native Son, so that people can really understand or begin to expose themselves to the experience of the individuals with whom they're going to work. I teach ethics. In ethics, I talk about what is your ethical obligation to engage in non-racist, non-biased work. Because if I can locate it in our ethical obligation, I say it's your ethical obligation to engage in racism. It is not me, musing over your multicultural competencies. The ethical code says this. Whether it's ASCA, whether it's ACA, whether it's APA, whether it's marriage and family therapy, whether it's in social work, whether it's in rehabilitation, every one of those ethics codes says we need to do this. Do no harm, right? So if we're going to engage in non-malfeasance, the flip side of that is beneficence. So it's not just do no harm, it is what am I doing to affirm the lived reality of the individual? And I think that's what we have to teach. And I think in doing that, it does two things. I'm sorry for jumping to the second question here, but I think it does two things. I think it changes how we're training folks, but I think it also lets students know or applicants what we are expecting. And that's what Dr. Jones, you were saying. What is the expectation? And I think when we own that expectation as institutions, I think we really change. The last thing I'll say, I'm sorry for running my mouth here, is I think we have to challenge institutions around this idea of inclusivity or inclusiveness and equity, right? I think we have to challenge it because all of our institutions outside of our HBCUs, or most of our HBCUs, that the majority of institutions started out as a way of excluding, right, and limiting the opportunities. So there wasn't equity in those institutions. And so we can't just, as if we're flipping a switch, one day say that we're inclusive and we engage in equity, when yesterday, before George Floyd was killed, we were engaging in exclusiveness and inequity. And so until we address those things, that I think we will continue to get the same outcome. We'll continue to get cisgender women or cis women who identify as being white, because the system continues to laud that. So I apologize for running my mouth. So I'll stop here. But again, thank you for the question.
Yeah, and that was said beautifully, brother. And I like what you said about ethics. And it's not about saying, how can I use my white privilege to help Black and brown people? That is unnerving to me, because it implies that you have power and we don't. And so instead, how can you be more human? How can you check your inhumanity? And not your white privilege, because that's what we're pushing, to be more than our intentions, to show actions, to do better, to recruit and invite more people of color to be teachers and mental health professionals and our leaders. I hate that we have to sell our humanity and why we need this work to people who may have certain positions of power. And we have to push back on, like I said, who has certain roles and responsibilities within our institutions and within our schools. And when it comes to better resources and helping people of color, we need to create spaces for us to heal and love ourselves. Because especially Black women, if I can say that, because some, you know, we don't have the same rules that's given to us as people of color. And so sometimes we end up doing more work. How do we create spaces for healing and loving ourselves and cultivating our wellness in these spaces and giving us the resources that we need, because our resources may look uniquely different than others. And as was already said, I cannot say it enough, we need to name and call out racial justice. We have been saying this for years. Some people are trying to wake up now, and we're thankful for anybody waking up. But we have been saying this for a long time, and it should not take a death of our brothers and sisters for you to say this is wrong.
I'd like to add just one thing. Is that okay? I'm thinking about the hiring practices. I've served on some search committees in higher education, and I used to serve on search committees for school counselors as well. And there just is a fear about having too many persons of color in one area, one school, one department, I think that fear has to be unleashed. You know, the fact that you don't know the person next to you, and by the way, in therapy, I meet a lot of different walks of life. Black, white, Hispanic, the litany of different persons are available in the therapy room, and I can't have fear. I can't have fear, nor can I discriminately choose which one comes in and doesn't come in because of that fear. So I think that's a part of it. Learn people, get to know people, be willing to be open. Why can you only have one Black person in a department? Doesn't make much sense to me if there were qualified applicants in the first place. On the other side of that, people of color have to be willing to go for these opportunities and not have that fear that they're going to be rejected, or it's going to be something in that system that prevents them from being who they're called to be. So I think the fear component is something that we all could benefit with working on, and that this ideal of not hiring too many needs to kind of die most immediately.
Thank you for speaking to that. I think that that is a real fear that doesn't just exist in education, but it exists in government and it exists in nonprofit. It exists in neighborhood communities, this fear of having too much representation of people of color to not overwhelm, to not outshine whiteness. I think a lot of the racial hostility we're experiencing in this country right now is because of the fear of, you know, people of color outnumbering white people in society at large. So thank you for just that reflection. I want to pose this next question to Goldie and to Angela. Both of you live in regions, Atlanta and Tulsa, that right now have historically been epicenters of racial violence. How does your experience, personal and professional, inform the way you approach educating and leading your colleagues and students?
Okay, I'll start. Yes, Tulsa experienced a horrible race massacre in 1921, but I really can't talk about the race massacre without talking about Black Wall Street. And Black Wall Street was a thriving upper class community of Black folk. They were doctors, lawyers, dentists, business owners, participating in their own economic structure because they couldn't do so in the white economic structure of Tulsa. So they had to create their own economy. And then, this is just a little history. A jealous white mob got very upset, and there was a claim that a Black man had assaulted a white woman on an elevator. And so this jealous white mob got together and just massacre, just basically burned 35 blocks of the Black Wall Street. So had it not been for the massacre, some would say that Tulsa would have been the Atlanta of the United States, you know? So that's basically what happened. But we didn't learn about Black Wall Street when I was in school in my history class. So it's something that I really learned about from word of mouth, people in the community, family members. And it's something that just within the last maybe few years, there's been more conversation and policies about trying to put this in the school systems, in the curriculum. So it is something that needs to be exposed and talked about. We're not learning about it formally within the educational system. And we can't move forward to the future if we don't know and understand our history. So that's the first thing we got to do, is start talking about it, getting it into the curriculum. So it does really affect how I work with students, in the sense that, you know, there's all of this civil unrest and racial violence that's going on in the world today. And so I do have to, as students are starting to understand the history and see what's going on in the world today, then they have more questions, and they're wanting to be more vocal and more of an advocate for themselves. So I try and allow them the space and the opportunity to discuss how they're feeling, to discuss those things. And it can be uncomfortable to talk about race, and not just with students of color, but with all ethnic groups of the students that I serve. So I try and create those outlets, those opportunities for them to talk individually or within groups, so that they can, you know, express what it is that they're feeling and get it out.
And just to add to that, you know, sometimes it feels shocking to me that my university is at the epicenter of Atlanta. Atlanta is Blackness, y'all. It is Black history. Atlanta is an example of justice. When you study our history here, we graduate at Georgia State University more Black undergraduates than any other university in this country. But there is such a lack of Black leaders, professors, and Blackness threaded throughout our programs. And that's the shocking part. We have a Black Studies department that is so small, and that should be sort of at the center. Now, we have leaders and colleagues that are examples of what's needed, and I'm thankful for the models that we have, and we have progress that we have made. But I was shocked coming in, this is my 7th year there. That was one of the shocking factors to me. As a Black Muslim woman, as a teacher educator, my own experiences have taught me that we need to be responsive to the histories, identities, and liberation of our students. We cannot teach all these Black kids, as an example, at Georgia State, and almost like not teach in ways that speak to their Blackness in our courses. We have to be, that's what culturally responsiveness is creating curriculum and instructional practices that are responsive to and relevant to who you have in front of you. And my own experiences have taught me that we have to be responsive to the racist, uneven, unjust times that we live in. So no matter if you're teaching psychology, a teacher ed program, a business, a law course, your syllabus needs to be anti-racist and responsive to justice, because we cannot teach in a bubble when all this stuff is happening around the university. So it taught me that everything has to be responsive. And lastly, I'll just say that we cannot do this work in artificial ways. We have to teach with the sake of kindness and love in unapologetic ways at the center. If you do not love who you teach, how can you fully teach them? And so I try to remind myself and remind other teacher educators and colleagues and teachers that I work with of these things.
If I can just add, and I really appreciate Angela and Dr. Goldie, what the two of you are saying. And I always like to say that I'm a Georgia State alum myself, so I definitely hear what you're saying. You know, I think this question, really thinking about you know, these seats or epicenters of racial violence. You know, for me, I think the U.S. is the epicenter for racial violence. I don't think that one city has a stronghold over its amount of racism. For me, racism is violence, not the physical affirmation of racism, but racism in and of itself. Dr. Jones talked about it earlier in terms of what happens when we experience these racial microaggressions, or what happens when we as Dr. Goldie was saying, we devalue the lived experience of all these individuals. So I think that the country itself is the epicenter. And so to echo what Dr. Goldie is saying, I think that this culturally responsive teaching pedagogy has to have that, not just saying, how do we, not just this acknowledgement. I think this is what you're saying. You correct me if I'm wrong here, but not just that racism and the other isms are present, but what is the anti-work that we have to engage in? And I think that is so important because since the death of Breonna Taylor and George Floyd, I find myself having been invited now to 3 different committees. I wonder what that's about, as it relates to dealing with diversity, equity, and inclusion. And so dealing with this, what I call a double-edged sword, I'm using the one end of the blade to make sure that I can be strategic, instrumental, and in some ways divisive. And what I mean by that is that I need us to move away from how we've been doing things traditionally every day. And Dr. Goldie, I think this is kind of what you're saying, but again, you correct me if I'm wrong, is how do we start to institute policy procedures, teaching in a way that is anti-ism, and that we do that in a way that gives us actionable plans, right? To say that we're dismantling this thing, that this thing no longer exists. Because we can talk about, Angela, as you were saying, we could talk about Black Wall Street in Tulsa and what happened to it, but people are left with, okay, this is a good historical information, but what do we do next? And so I do think, and Angela, I think you also mentioned social justice as a part of your training. I do think that we start thinking about, through social justice, what are these systems of inequity, and how do we begin to clearly and in a more formalized way address those systems of inequity, not on an individual level, that's important, but also at that meso and at that macro level, so it becomes institutionalized and everyone begins to buy into this need for this institutional and systemic change. So I'll stop there, but thank you, Ebony, so much for allowing me to add on to that.
Absolutely. We're going to move into a time of Q&A. And so I'm going to throw this question to all of you and have Dr. Jones start first. We've had questions about trauma-informed practices, class standards, SEL, and the DSM. How do we use or stop using existing frameworks to help student mental health embrace anti-racism? And as I mentioned, and that's a very complex question, but let's start with Dr. Jones as we answer here.
Okay, so I heard pieces. So DSM, trauma-informed care.
Class standards, CLAS standards.
Okay, class standards.
In the DSM and SEL, and trauma-informed practices.
Okay, so I can say from a trainer's perspective, it is very challenging to push against structures that we have to be able to pay for services and get access to services. So the strategy and approach that I think that we all can take is to recognize what's behind those things, like the DSM, and like I mentioned earlier, that Black and Brown people have been over-pathologized in many ways when it comes to particular diagnoses. And so the place that I feel like we can do something is to have the recognition that those are already built, those are practices and principles that are built on whiteness. And if we recognize it for what it is, then we can shift our practices by saying, okay, that's where what's normalized. Let me not pathologize things that are different. Let me try and look at it in the context of the community of the individual that I'm working with. So I don't say we dismiss DSM. I say we look at the DSM, but then we go to a very important part of the DSM that nobody reads, and that's the cultural formulation evaluation interview at the back. And there's a reason for it. That one is how you really get to understand the sociocultural history of a person. And it's funny to me that very few people actually even pay attention to that part, because that's where I start, is actually understanding the person before I go to do any kind of interpretation of what their pathology is. So I think if we look at our practices, understand what they're built on, and do adaptations to make sure that we're seeing the person for who they are as a whole person, that we can do better. But we can't necessarily throw them away and then spend time like me trying to do studies to build new principles for us to be paying attention to. It's my little small scale.
Can I go next?
Yes.
Okay, great. So, you know, we need the DSM and models like that, particularly if you are in private practice or you're accepting insurance and things of that nature. I guess what I try to do with the DSM-5 is to really look at where any loophole can be found. And this may sound counter to what we're supposed to do, but honestly, the experience, the racial violence that our clients or our students may go through, I think you have to find, where does this fit? Again, there's researchers that are already linking the extreme stress, the extreme racism to post-traumatic stress disorder. There's ways of making that linkage, I believe, when you have these experiences to certain indices or criteria that exist within the DSM-5. In your case noting, in your treatment planning, you go ahead and break down the how you're getting to the diagnosis. And that vehicle can absolutely be through processing the experience, through establishing goals to kind of help them extrapolate and better understand what they've gone through. So I think all of that primarily can remain the same, but it comes down to your treatment plan, the goals that are established, and how you plan on really working that component of the diagnosis, if you will, that criteria.
All right, so I'm gonna flip this next question to Mcquee, since you're in North Dakota. As a school mental health professional in a non-diverse community, I'm curious as to how I can create a safe space group for my students of color. We unfortunately have limited staff of color, and with COVID cannot have outside providers come into the school. And so based on the question, what would your response be?
I appreciate the question. I think it's a challenge, but I don't think it is without a solution. I think one of the first things is, I think that my white colleagues and our white allies have to see themselves as such. And so that we're not always and forever dependent on the Black, the Latinx, the Arabic, the Native American folks to have the resources, energy, and wherewithal. Not that we're not capable or nor have the intellectual acumen, but recognizing that this work is not singular work. And so I do think that the buy-in has to be where we get our white allies and white colleagues to say this is important and to be a part of that experience. And so to not assume that then the faculty of color, the counselors of color, or the paraprofessionals of color are going to engage in that work. I think the other thing is that probably like most of my colleagues here, and Ebony, you as well as our facilitator, you know, if somebody were to look at your contract, you're probably doing over 100% work. So, you know, my thing is that we don't just go then to the people of color and say, do more work, and not be incentivized or not being supported for engaging in that work. And so I think that's really important. So I think where in communities where, and again, I do live in North Dakota, and it's probably 80-something% white, that I do think that there has to be one, this recognition of this being something being important. And I think historically it hasn't been recognized as being important. Thus, then it falls on, again, Dr. Jones, Dr. Mohammed, all Dr. Wines, Angela, all of my colleagues to do this work and not have it validated. So I think that how do we do it then? I think that we form collaboratives where we're saying that we have white and faculty of color or teachers of color or peers who are involved in this process. That we say that this is mutually important, not just for the students of color, but for the white students as well, right? In terms of what benefit can they gain from being exposed to the practices around social justice and multiculturalism. And so I think that we can't just then say, let's make sure that we have space for our students of color for support. I think we also need to have groups for white students where we are challenging them around their own values that are rooted in white supremacy and racism. I think we have to have those things, simultaneously and not mutually exclusive, because we have Black folks and all these other people of color doing hard work and understanding their place and positionality in society, and white folks aren't. It doesn't make a difference, because what's going to continue to happen is Black folks are like, I'm going to assert myself, and white folks and other folks who ascribe to white supremacy are going to continue to say, I'm going to engage in racism as violence. So again, as I said earlier, it's important that we read Carter G. Woodson, as Dr. Goldie was saying, and it's important that we read bell hooks, and it's important that we are aware of what's happening historically. But if we are not asking or not demanding that people change, we're going to have folks of color who are active and who are actively getting beat. John Lewis got beat walking across the Pettus Bridge, not because he wasn't woke, but because the community in which he was walking through decided that he did not have value. They still saw him as chattel in perpetuity. That's what this nation was built on. In perpetuity, I will see you as property forever and always. And until we can change that, I'm sorry for speaking long here. I am emotional because it is important to me. I have children who look like me. And I cannot and I will not allow a school counselor, a teacher, a paraprofessional to tell my child other than they are valued. And I think then we have to speak to our white colleagues as such. I tell folks all the time, I'm trying to get myself out of my job. And what do I mean by that? I have to speak my truth. And it's not just a subjective postmodernist truth. It is a truth based in reality. And if I get fired for me telling my truth, then I have stood on my principle and I have made the ancestors proud. And I think those are the things that I think we have to stand on. And I think that, and I'm sorry again for my long-winded response here, but I think those are the things that we have to do. And I'm always, always welcome to talk to folks offline or another time and say more, how do we strategize? But those are my thoughts. So again, I appreciate the comment. I apologize for being long-winded there.
Thank you. You've got me emotional too. I was like, I'm feeling it. The last question is posed for Dr. Goldie. We have a few more minutes, and I want to toss you this question. We have lots of questions about how to interrupt deficit mindsets and narratives, shift thinking and language in school. What are your thoughts for our work?
So that's a great question. It's also a broad question. And so I try to be very practical. There's a lot of things we need to do first in a structural or systemic level, and that's the work I'm engaged in right now. I'm trying to change 4 central areas. One is the Common Core state standards. They are not responsive to what our students need, especially our Black and Brown students in our classrooms. They are grounded in skills only. So I am working with folks like Bettina Love to create equity, full standards for learning. 2 is our curriculum. We need to hold curriculum companies responsible for what they write and put in front of our students. It is not, we do not live in times where skills only curriculum that is devoid of students' identity and criticality and intellectualism. So we have to hold them to the fire on creating culturally responsive curriculum for our students. The third is state assessments. They need to assess more than student skills. We use state assessments in such deficit and traumatic ways. It creates trauma for teachers and students. And then the fourth is teacher evaluation. Teachers need to be evaluated on their ability of developing consciousness, anti-racism, and identity development, not just teaching skills. So that's the stuff that I'm working on a systemic level. I provide an equity framework, in my book, Cultivating Genius. I use this framework from studying the practices of Black folks historically, which teaches identity, skills, intellect, and criticality. That's something that we can do tomorrow or today when it comes to teaching and learning, lesson plans and pedagogies. And there are lots of examples. I can also send lesson plan examples, but that's the stuff we have to do. We have to do the systemic, the structural work, and then we have to do what we can while I and many others are trying to dismantle the system. I mean, that's the truth of it.
Thank you, Dr. Goldie, for that rich response. My ears perked up when you said Bettina Love. So I love her work. This session has been rich, really, really rich. We have a few more minutes before we close. And so I'm wondering if we could do a quick go around, like one sentence, which we really can't sum up into one sentence, but one short sentence around what advice and ask and invitations do you have for the listeners on the line so we can collectively think about school mental health workforce's role in supporting the navigation of racial violence.
Okay, should I just start? Okay, so I'll just say, you know, be the genius that you want to see for others. Be the model. This is not something you just do in your profession. You have to live it. It has to be your culture and your way of life, consciousness. And be kind. Start with love. Love is always the answer to any problem that you will have. That's my long sentence.
Thank you.
Okay, I'll go next. I believe that, you know, we cannot change socialization, but we can change or start to fix social constructs through education. Education is the key to change. And let's just remember that and be kind to one another.
Okay, I'll go next. I think that there's a charge evident in my mind as I've done a lot of research, and that is there should not be a disparity between mental health, clinical mental health and school counseling. I'd like to see that gap close so that school counselors are empowered to know that you are very much trained like mental health professionals, and this idea of racial sensitivities and being sensitive to those experiences as a practitioner, as a clinician, as a researcher, would be my charge to all the attendees today.
I'm struggling for the one sentence. I'll just say, remember that racism is an ACE. It's traumatic, it's chronic, and that if we remember that youth are interpreting their life experiences through this lens, and that their bodies don't know the difference between physical pain and psychological pain, that it's the same, that we can do better by serving the whole child and paying attention to that this trauma is real.
If I think about the sentence here, I think we need to be bold, be brave, be courageous and committed to dismantling racism and finding value in those people who have often been undervalued and dehumanized.
Thank you all for your time today. I'm going to toss it back to Jessica to close out.
Thank you so much, Ebony, for supporting the conversations for both sessions of this learning forum. And a huge thank you to our amazing panelists for sharing their thoughts and expertise. And last but not least, thanks to all of you for attending today and for listening, for sharing. We encourage you to fill out our survey today and let us know how you would like us as your MHTTC network to help you in continuing your learning. We want to know more about your interests and needs, and we'll also be compiling all resources shared today and sending those out in a continued learning opportunity resource soon. We'll also be sending out the slides, the recording, and a certificate of attendance for today's session. Again, please visit our website to stay informed on upcoming trainings and additional resources from our network. We just launched our Back to School resource collection that highlights our back to school mental health programming, as well as other MHTTC products and resources that are specific to school mental health and that can be useful when coping with the effects of widespread public health crises. We send our appreciation and thanks to all school mental health professionals, educators, and other school personnel for their dedication and caring for our children. Thank you, everyone, and take care.